Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Amon Mission podcast. Today, talk about, the great tight ends of the league. Obviously, Cole Kmet's up there, see how we rank him. But we also do cover some of the best offensive line units and the defensive line units. So, stay tuned and enjoy the show. Welcome again, everybody. We got a lot of fun in store, like I said earlier. But today, the main topics are the tight ends, offensive line, and defensive line units. And so, it's kind of the next part of our, top five position rankings. Um, so like last week we talked about quarterback, running back, receiver, just continuing through that progression, and um, excited to get started. But like I said, we're going to start off with the tight ends the best. And so, I guess what's some of the criteria or things that you looked at when ranking your tight ends?
Yeah, tight end is probably one of the hardest positions to play on offense because you're asked to do so much. Like other than quarterback, obviously, you're asked to block, you're asked to catch the ball, be a red zone target, like understand when to leak out and understand who you're supposed to chip. If you're facing quality edge rusher like Nick Bosa or like Joey Bosa on the other side in the AFC, like you have a lot of responsibilities as a tight end. So when I was creating this list, um, yes, for like fantasy purposes, you want to target like the receiving heavy threats, but in real life football, the blocking is also extremely important because you're going to stay on the field longer if you could play on the running downs and the passing downs. And as a team for a whole, it makes them multidimensional. They can use you more, and that makes you more powerful. So I was looking at a combination of run blocking, pass blocking when needed, and also receiving as well.
hmm Yeah, that's a pretty good set of stuff. One thing I mine's basically the same as that, but I added kind of one thing additional, which is I guess the connection they have with their quarterback. I think that, like you said, guys that know when to leak out underneath, or guys that know, I guess, how to read their quarterback size, because typically these tight ends are the safety options for their, respective quarterbacks. And so I feel like tight ends with that stronger connection are able to perform better. And I think that was one thing that also went into my list of, or my list of rankings and categorizing which tight ends are the best.
Yeah, and to go off of that, I think that's a great point you made. And I think unintentionally, I happen to look at my top three now, and I'm realizing, yeah, they do have that connection more so than if you get to the bottom, like past like 3 and 4, I think,
hmm
in comparison. So like that's an extra criteria I considered unintentionally. Yeah, that's
hmm
I agree with you there,
Uh
definitely.
huh. Yeah, and so do you just want to go in and kind of, say who your number five guy was, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah, so my number five guy is very interesting because his career overall grade, like from when he started, and particularly when like the starting tight end for that team moved out previously, was really high. It was only behind Travis Kelsey, George Kittle, and Mark Andrews. Um, he actually only dropped 2 passes all of last year, fourth most in explosive plays. Um, with 27, and his yards per route run 1.76. That's really good because you're not he's not running like drag routes or like flat routes where he's just like leaking out. He's like running more than that. That's what that stat tells you. And with his 96.1 catchable rate, ranking among second among all tight ends, I think in the offense he's in and the capabilities they used him in, it's only going to get better with more weapons and more experience for his quarterback. And it's Dallas Goddard. I think at times he's the number two receiver on that team, even above Devontae Smith. And at the same time, he was huge for that running game as well with the Eagles. As you know, like when we discuss the Eagles, they have like one of the best lines, like running back in the league. And adding a guy like Goddard to that only makes that more powerful when you have a running quarterback who can now throw as well,
hmm
almost as equally as he can run, and then like a potent running attack from last year. He was a huge part of what they did on both sides of the ball. So that's why I have him five.
hmm Yeah, I think that's it's a good spot to have him because I too also put Dallas Goddard as my number five guy. um, like you said, he just kind of does everything pretty good. Barring his injury last season, I think he was on pace for about 850 to 900 receiving yards, which is pretty incredible for that tight end position. Obviously, over the past couple of years, we've seen more and more tight ends kind of go up in that receiving, I guess, category. But um, yeah, I think that with that, he'd be, one of the top three or four, I think, tight ends in terms of receiving. And you add that to his run block ability that he grades so well at. And I think just the fact that he's able to do so much in an already loaded offense and is able to stand out again in this loaded offense kind of goes to show how talented of a player he is. And I think that, another season of this type of production will at least cement this type of rating for, I think, for him in most other people's eyes as well.
Yeah, and it's really tough with the top four I have currently because they're a little bit more established in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And plus it's only in his like second year that he fully started for that team. So it's more of this thing where like he's always had top five talent, and now is like the only time when he's been able to showcase and get the opportunities to show them. So
Mm-hmm.
similar to how I talk like rave about Foster Moreau, who was on the Raiders, Las Vegas Raiders, and now on the Saints, having that top five potential. Dallas Goddard already showed that when Ertz was on the field, even that. So it's more. It's not a question of talent. Um, it was just a question of like experience, like showcasing that talent. That's why I probably have
Mm-hmm.
him lower than the others, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I agree with that. I mean, we both put him at number five. We have similar criteria, and yeah, I think even for me too, I think the top four guys are just that almost that next tier above him, which is kind of weird to say that, the top four tight ends are almost in a tier of their own, even though he put up incredible numbers and he showcases just great talent across every tight end metric that you can really think of. But yeah, who do you so I guess moving on, uh who's the guy you think is just better than Dallas Goddard?
I think it's a guy who has a more loaded offense as far as receiving weapons, and that's crazy to say. Like looking at what the Eagles have, um, and it's more so like on paper what they have. He had a down year with injury and just like struggling. That whole offense struggle, but he's always had a really good red zone rapport with his quarterback, and it's usually around like 30% target share, like amongst the whole team. And even with these additions, I could still see him commanding like a 20% target share because the way they use their tight ends and that offense is like they utilize their tight ends in the red zone and multiples of that in different ways. So I still think he can get positive numbers and still be a top five capable tight end. Um, he's just had more experience, more stats, obviously, and more chance to just show like he's a red zone powerhouse. It's Mark Andrews. And even with the addition of like Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, and Odell, he's the one that's probably shown that he's the healthiest among the bunch. And obviously, we don't know what happens with Zay Flowers because he's a rookie coming in. But I think in this offense, with the addition of those weapons, a lot of people say, "Oh, his volume is going to go down," but I disagree. I think it's going to vary game by game, and I think his efficiency on the volume he does get is going to be spectacular because you can throw him in the seam routes, you can throw him like in the play action pass. He's still like the primary play action threat that you're going to throw to because you're sucking up the linebackers with Lamar Jackson's running ability, with J.K. Dobbins finally coming back healthy and we hope he's going to start the season. But I just look at all this, and I don't see a chance where he's going to go anywhere and like be featured out of that offense. So
Mm-hmm.
I have him at number four.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a solid pick. Yeah, I think yeah, he's going to be really efficient this year, and he's the most, I guess, stable option, at least when you're looking at history of players outside of obviously the rookie picks. But I kind of went a different route with my number four tight end on this list. I think if I were to make this list maybe 2 years ago, maybe 1.5 years ago, I'd have this guy maybe at my number two spot, but just kind of with the emergence of a couple other guys, and then just kind of how he's played over the past little bit, he bumps down to 4, which still is really good for me. But the guy I have here is George Kittle. With George Kittle, I think physically and like knowledge wise, I think he could be the number one on this list. But I guess look at how availability is the best ability, and when he's on the field, he's unbelievably talented. He's unstoppable, but I just feel like he's lacked, I guess, some of that play time that you want from these top tight ends. And we kind of see that with Darren Waller as well, and how Darren Waller, talent wise, is could be a top 5 guy as well, top 3 potentially, but just kind of like him almost disappearing due to injury, and then maybe offensive scheme kind of has me put him down lower on this list, and likewise with George Kittle, he goes a little bit lower here, but the reason why he, despite his injuries, that he makes my top 5 is his just great physicality that he plays with. Every down that he plays, he really has that dog in him. Um, he I'm pretty sure that he enjoys blocking almost more than scoring touchdowns. Just like when you look at him play football, he just seems happy to be just plowing guys down, just knocking them out of the way and stuff. And so, he's maybe one of the best, if not the best, run block tight end in the league. And you tag that along with just elite, receiving ability that we saw his breakout year. I think it was sophomore season that he like had broken the record for tight end receiving yards. And so, um, obviously, again, that is a couple years ago, and so he's a couple years away from that, and that's why he stays at my 4. But he could easily, with a healthy season, bump up to like number 1 or 2 this year.
Yeah, that's why I have him above Mark Andrews on my list. I have him as number 3. And I look at George Kittle, and he said it himself. He prefers to block more than he does to catch. So that just shows you how much passion he has for playing the game of football, and not about getting his numbers and everything like that. But George Kittle, I have him higher than Mark Andrews because of that run blocking ability that you mentioned. It makes him so scheme versatile in what Kyle Shanahan's trying to do. He can call almost any run, and he's not going to show any lapses in his technicality because he has that in the run blocking game. And I think I might be lower on him too because of the amount of weapons that are on this team and how many ways you can get those weapons the ball. Where like I'm looking at Deebo Samuel, I'm seeing him slowly phase out of the offense because of the ways they can use Christian McCaffrey and Brandon Ayuk now. But you can use them more in the receiving game. And I'm looking at George Kittle. He's not going to be relied as much in volume. Um, sort of like how I project Andrews will do this season. But I think because of his blocking ability, he'll be more valuable to the 49ers. Because if George Kittle goes down, who's their backup that's going to take his place? Obviously, that's really hard. Like, if there's 2 tight ends that are going to reach, like, Kelsey's tier of receiving production, it's Kittle and Andrews. It's Kittle and Andrews. And then maybe another guy that I have in my top 2. But I could see those 2 reaching that tier because they're the 2 most like Kelsey, where they're like extremely important for their team and they can be used in multiple different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, like these guys are so good that it really is quite interchangeable, I think, with these rankings, and like bouncing from 4 to 3 just between our own rankings. And for the most part, I think we have almost the same guys in our tight end ranking list. But moving on to my number 3 guy, I have TJ Hawkinson from the Minnesota Vikings. He was traded midway through last season from the Detroit Lions, and just kind of looking at his stats, I do believe that his efficiency and his just target share, I think, increased as he went to the Vikings. I think he, had more receiving yards throughout the season, and and I think that the Lions offense was firing on all cylinders last season, and the Vikings offense was, going crazy last season. And I think that the fact that while they both were good, he was able to transition pretty seamlessly onto to a different offense was pretty nice to see. And that plus, I know he's probably not the best run blocker, but he's still, I think, graded above average for tight ends in the league, and he was pretty efficient in that blocking when he was playing. I think when he came out of the draft, there was the whole discussion between him and Noah Fant, just being from the same school, and he went a couple spots higher than Fant for a reason. He has that run blocking ability. He's a little bit more physical, and that plus we've seen his receiving ability. I think just showcases that he is one of the best tight ends in the league, and I think um, that he'll just continue, putting up great numbers and potentially even having his best season yet next year with the Vikings.
Yeah, I think this guy, if he's not like on Kelsey and Andrews' tier as receiving ability wise, he's like very close to it. I don't think he'll ever reach Kelsey's tier as receiving, but how is he expected to when you got one of the best receivers in the game on the same team who's a better focal point for the Vikings? And it was so interesting to me how he defied like arguments where if he's the primary option on the Detroit team and like leans on him and Amon-Ra St. Brown, they're like 1A, 1B. And then he goes to a better situation with better weapons and a better receiver, and he puts up better numbers. How that works out for his like ability. I think the world saw like what TJ Hawkinson could do if he was the focal point in like the Vikings games. I remember I was playing a couple fantasy games and I just happened to be facing TJ Hawkinson that week. He went off for like 40 or 50 points, and I'm just like, oh man, if he puts this up every time, he's like a Kelsey monster, obviously. But I think where the Vikings rank top 5 in pass rate is going to be very beneficial for him. And I think although he might not finish as like a top 3 tight end due to like the talent around him, and they just added Addison as well. He's gonna finish in that top 5 range for sure. I think for me picking him number 2, I think it's looking at what he can do in the receiving option if he was assigned a primary role and saying, I think he's a better option than how I ranked Kittle, Goddard, and Andrews, just because of what he means to this team and how much he can do. Plus, he still has the run blocking ability. He's not as good as Kittle, but I think he has better receiving ability than
Hmm. Yeah, and again here, we saw I have Kittle at 4, Josh had Kittle at 3, and now I have Hawkinson at 3, and Josh has Hawkinson at 2, and so like these guys are all just good players. I mean, even on fantasy, you could probably just have these guys would be just great guys to have anyways. Even though we talked big game about blocking abilities, tight ends. I think that's why they're so viable for fantasy. Is just the fact that they're always going to be on the field, and because they're always on the field, they're going to be an option in the receiving game no matter what, which which is elite. But I know Josh talked about my number 2 tight end a little bit earlier, but I went with Mark Andrews as my number 2 guy. I think the big thing for me here was the quarterback connection that he had. The way, him and Lamar when they're both on the field. I think it's outside of, I guess, Kelsey and Mahomes. I don't think there's a better, I guess, quarterback tight end connection in the league. And so had him here, he grades well as a run blocker and he's an elite pass catcher. When I look at him play, he feels like a 30-year-old player, who's just been like a veteran of the league for almost like a decade. And he's, I mean, he's still been in the league for a minute, but like the the fact that he plays so well and just seems so experienced as a player, it's hard to think that he's only like 27 years old right now. And the fact that you have him plus Lamar likely going to be teammates for the next however many years, um, really cements him as my number 2 guy, and just he meets all the metrics as all these other guys that I've listed before, but he has, I think, the best connection out of the other players that I've listed with their quarterback, and so I kept him here at the number 2.
Yeah, and I think that's a great valuation. I think fits perfectly with the criteria you would list out for your tight ends. So I think from that standpoint, I have no argument for 2.
Hmm.
Um, I think I valued the run blocking and pass blocking a little bit higher, just because of
Hmm.
what it means in a team dynamic. But you can make the cases for both sides. Like better connection with the quarterback is going to lead to better receiving efficiency versus okay, running a pass block is going to lead to more efficiency in the run game because now you don't have to take off your tight end off the field and add an extra block or something
Mhm.
like that. You can show multiple looks. So like, there's either ways you can go on this, and frankly, the only differences in our list is pretty much where we rank Mark Andrews, and that was like 2 versus 4. So I think we're pretty much in alignment where like these guys from like 2 to 5, they're pretty much in the same tier, or there might be like two sub tiers uh, between that. And to have Mark Andrews at 2, it's perfectly acceptable.
Mhm.
I think both of us had an unequivocal number one tight end in Cole Kmet. And who else could we argue but him? According to Chicago native, he's from Chicago. They're just about to fake out. Bears are about to go 17-0. No, who are we kidding? It's Travis Kelce. It's Travis Kelce. Nobody else. Nobody else. He's basically a wide receiver one on the Kansas City Chiefs. He is the wide receiver one on the Kansas City Chiefs. Going into in this 11th year, he's a cheat code for anybody who picked him up last year. And I think if you looked at his 2.23 yards per route run, and then his receiving grade for all tight ends with 250 yards, it's monstrous. It's absolutely monstrous. And at this stage of his career, like you mentioned with Andrews, like he knows how to settle down in the zones. He is quarterback friendly. Whether it was Alex Smith, whether it was Patrick Mahomes, it doesn't matter. He's gonna just look at the nasty bow he put on TJ Edwards in the Super Bowl, where he just like goes inside, looks like he's about to do like one of those crossing routes, and then like whips it back the outside and just like dusts him completely. And he does that to anybody, Jalen Ramsey, like any primary cornerback, like no matter who you line up against him, he's going to torch. And I think the one difference between him and the other tight ends we talked about is you can game plan against him, and it won't even matter. It won't even matter. That's what separates him from everybody else.
Mhm. Yeah, I like Josh said, I also have Travis Kelsey as my number one guy for the tight end. Oops, the tight end room. But yeah, it's kind of funny because he's, in my opinion, probably the worst blocker out of this bunch. But his receiving capabilities are so much greater than literally everybody else in the list and in the league that he's undeniably the best tight end in the league. We're currently watching, likely a first ballot Hall of Famer play football right in front of us from the tight end position. Like he's 35-ish, right? Isn't he 35? And like I swear
I think so. Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
way old. And like
He's
he
at least like 33, 34.
right? And he does not play like a tight end who's in his mid 30s. He seems like he's still in his prime, and he's the type of guy that I feel like is going to keep on playing until he quite literally physically can't play football. And he just such a smart player that even when his physical skills have diminished, and they may already be diminishing, but just the fact that he's such a high NFL IQ allows him to stay relevant in the league in terms of being an elite route runner, finding soft spots in the zone, and just being able to make difficult catches, which is pretty amazing. And so that's why I have him at the number one. And obviously his connection with Mahomes, is unbelievable. I feel like those two on the field together, you can never count them out. It's almost like just when Brady and Gronk are on the field together, it's like, oh well, they have like a 30 seconds left in the game. Oh, they got it. It's the same feeling, but it's he's an incredible player. But um, next up we do have the offensive linemen, or the offensive line units, I guess, and we're just gonna go through these. I think for the most part we do have a lot of similarities as well here. But what were some of the things you looked at in terms of offensive linemen?
I look at cohesiveness. I also look at individual talent, and I look at um, how many times do you need help? Like, what's like the pressure rates you're allowing, and that kind of like dictated like what my rankings are because now like it's too easy to just say like sacks allowed because if they come off on a blitz, and you're trying to block a blitz, it's nearly impossible. If they send like 7 and you have your running back to help, which means you're blocking 6 and somebody comes free and it happens to be on your side. So I find those stats very hard to like quantify that offensive lineman being good or bad for allowing that sack. So I look at the pressure rates for sure, and then I also look how well does he work with his teammates to handle stunts and pressures on that sort. So those are the kind of things I'm looking into.
Mhm. Yeah, I looked kind of into that. I kind of try to look at some of the individual metrics of like just kind of how they graded out as run blockers and pass blockers. Kind of looked at maybe some of the accolades some of these guys were getting, and like if I hadn't really known too deeply about some of these players, and then I also try to look at some of the off or the the team's just playmaking ability in terms of is this offense efficient? And I think that was just another thing that went into my thinking because, even a great line that I guess plays well, but not well enough to keep the offense flowing, I think is not a good offensive line. You could play great. Your guys could play great 90% of the time, but then each person's 10% bad play is at different parts of the game. That just kind of throws off the entire rhythm of the offense. And so just seeing an efficient offense, regardless of skill position players, I think was a small thing that also went into my head when I made some of these rankings.
Yeah, and for sure. I think you'll look at my number five O line and you'll be surprised by who it is because there's a lot of new faces. One of the rookies who wasn't available last year is just coming on. And it's a classic case of don't pay attention to the sack numbers and associated with the logo. Don't logo scout or like logo blame because that's where you're going to get lost in how last year is going to project to this year. So, with that said, this team allowed 38 sacks last year, 19th in rushing, and their average yardage by per down was like 4.3. So you're probably thinking, why in the world do I have them as like the fifth best O line in the NFL? And I picked the New Orleans Saints as a unit because when I look at what they had to deal with last year with their first round pick, missing 11 games, their star right tackle, Ryan Ramczyk, who only allowed 3 sacks on the whole year, despite not missing any games, but dealing with knee issues, that was incredible to me. Their center missed 4 games. Their guard, Cesar Ruiz, missed 3. And Andres Pete missed 6 games as well. But when I
Mm-hmm.
look at the highs of this team, I just find it incredible because they rushed over 200 yards against Seattle and Cincinnati. And that was with bad quarterback play where people know you're going to run the ball. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, the combined pass rush units of San Francisco, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, all who I have as top 5 defenses going into this year, guess how many sacks they've allowed to those 3 teams combined?
Oh, me? Oh,
Yeah.
what?
You're the only one on this call. Yeah.
I
But
thought it was a rhetorical question, but you paused for a
no,
little bit, and
just
so.
3 sacks. 3 sacks in total,
Hmm.
which is hard to believe because that's like one for each of these teams. And um, you know how formidable San Francisco is, let alone like Cleveland and Pittsburgh, who always have great defenses.
Hmm.
And to only allow like 3 sacks despite all that went on for that unit, I just look at the cohesiveness and the backups in that situation, and
Hmm.
then the starters coming in together. I think this unit is being wholly underlooked. And when we discussed the Saints on the podcast for the NFC South, I mentioned this group could easily have a top 5 offense in the league this year. If that's going to happen, it's because of this O line.
Hmm. Yeah, I was surprised to see the Saints on here, but I looked at their team and I'm like, well, I mean, the way we predicted, I guess, how their season would go, it does make sense, to put them at this kind of high ranking, and just looking at some of the players on that offensive line, it's pretty easy to see. And I think that most of the offensive lines, I think, are pretty, it's pretty up to debate, I think, on ranking them just because each unit has its own strengths, its weaknesses, and um, kind of going off that each player have your own individual opinions on players, and um, we don't know how units will go on as players leave, players come in through the draft and free agency. But I guess for my number 5 group, I had the Baltimore Ravens offensive line unit. This offensive line unit was pretty good last season. I know I said that, how well the offense performed was a big metric for me, and their passing game was kind of weak last season, obviously due to I think heavy injuries just in their receiving room and the quarterback situation, which was pretty unfortunate for them. But despite all this, they were still the number 2 rushing team in the league, and teams it was pretty easy for teams to key in on this offense just to commit to run stopping, and the fact that they were able to still to be the number 2 rush offense in the league, and obviously the run game is won mostly through the trenches, and so I have them ranked here. A lot of their guys are pretty established players in the league as well. I know they lost Ben Powers in free agency, who had a career year last season, but they have I think Ben Cleveland coming in this upcoming season, who should hopefully be pretty good for them. And so I think, yeah, right, yeah, they got Ben Cleveland filling in, plus Ronnie Staley, who's one of the best left tackles in the league. Tyler Linderbaum was pretty good. Kevin Zeitler, and then Morgan Moses might be one of the weaker links on this offensive line. But whether or not you think, I guess, they're like the best individual players, this is a really efficient unit. Just last season, they only allowed 24 penalties, which was a league low last season. And I think that's a huge thing, is the fact that this offense is not getting held back at all by their offensive line. I feel like you see a lot of other teams that they'll have a big play, and then you'll see, oh, holding number 72 offense or whatever, and then this huge play gets completely pulled back, and it kills the momentum completely for a team. But with the Ravens, I know that I can trust them to play sound football and not commit those penalties and help keep their offensive flow going.
Yeah, no, great points there. I didn't see Ben Cleveland on the starting lineup, but he could end up being on that
Hmm.
because I remember being high on him in the draft. Like I
Hmm.
was just like, wow, this is a classic case of the Ravens just waiting for the draft board to fall to them and getting a quality guard prospect in the first round.
Hmm.
Right now, it's John Simpson. That could easily change, I feel like, as camp progresses. But
Hmm.
I hear you. I hear you on this team. When their running game was like up and running, no pun intended, they had a lot of great line play from who's the tackle who just left Kansas City from
Oh
Baltimore.
shoot.
I don't know. I'm blanking on
Didn't he
his
go to
name.
Did he go to the Bengals? Was it?
I think so. I think he ended up going to the Bengals actually.
Or was it Orlando Brown? That's what it
Orlando
was.
Brown, yes, yeah. When Brown was on that team, they were an amazing run unit, and I think they're going to get right back to it, despite what Todd Monken is going to bring to the passing game. And if they're going to be successful on the ground, it's because of this whole line, because that's what the Ravens hang their hat on. For me, I didn't go that route. I went with a different team in the AFC North because I like the guard duo in the Cleveland Browns better than I do with the Ravens. And that's very hard to say because Baltimore has solid options, but I don't think anybody is touching the duo of um, Joe Batonia and Wyatt Teller. Because when you look at that combination, you could run power in any direction. You could flip it if you don't like the look on like the front seven. You could literally go on Madden, flip the play in real life with this lineup
Mhm.
because of how versatile and like how equally good these guards are. They're the best guard duo in the league. And then I look at Jack Conklin and Jedrick Wills. They're quality, if not really good, tackle prospects. And for my favorite running back in the league, in Nick Chubb, I'm just like, this is a perfect situation to drop yourself into. For Deshaun Watson, he's not going to have to run for his life every play. He's going to get really good blocking around him. And ever since Kevin Stefanski stepped into that head coaching role for this team, they've been absolutely amazing at their run game. And the major reason why is their investment in the offensive line. And I think it's only going to continue. I don't see why it gets worse for this team. They're always like
Mhm.
one of the top 5 units in the league. And I think this year is going to be no different.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the Clevelands are bound to just be good just because of their offensive line. And I don't have them at 4. I have them a little bit higher in my rankings here. But my number 4 guys that I have was the Detroit Lions. um, I think the Lions, I mean, they just had a good season last year. I think we really saw just the offense as a whole, what their potential was. I think, they really exploded onto the scene, and you can't really do that without, having elite run blocking. And I think one thing that we saw in terms of their run blocking was just the goal line touchdowns that they had. Jamal Williams had a career year last season with 1,000 yards rushing and led the league in rushing touchdowns. And while I think he is a good short yardage back, I think that having an elite offensive line certainly helps um, for this here. And I think just throughout the season, I think we've just seen this offensive line really step up last year and be elite run blockers. Like week 1, I think DeAndre Swift. I mean he's a good running back, but I think he went 10 carries for 100 rush yards. He was week 1 he averaged 10 yards a carry, and I think that these are the types of guys that will win it in the trenches. And um, you know these guys are either developed guys into the league or guys on the rise. Like Penei Sewell, he's relatively new, but he's already made a name for himself. The right tackle Vaitai, I don't know, his first name's probably not too hard to pronounce, but for the sake of time, I'm going to call him Vaitai. But um, he is one of those guys who's on the rise. He fits the Lions mentality of, just being kind of a mauler player. Frank Ragnow's one of the best centers in the league. He may be the best center in the league. Jonah Jackson, he's gotten better every year. And then Taylor Decker's Taylor Decker. Plus, I do think they have pretty solid depth behind this starting 5 as well.
Yeah,
But
I think it's a ceiling pick with this team. I'm going to try and by hand Vaitai's first name later. That's how highly I think of this team. Um, but it's a good bet because they've had a lot of problems on the interior line. They addressed that this offseason. And I think it's a major plus when you look at the rest of the roster. So I have them higher than this group, but the next group I've had a revolving door once their left tackle got hurt before the first game of the season, and they had to pivot and go to a rookie in Tyler Smith for the Dallas Cowboys, and he played absolutely phenomenal. So much so, in fact, they slotted him the left guard right next to the tackle he was replacing, and keeping largely the same roster with one of the best guards in the league in Zach Martin, which is hard to say because you have Quentin Nelson on the other side of the AFC. And when Quentin Nelson was at his best, Zach Martin was better. And you can argue he's the best guard in the league prominently now. And while I have them at 3 because of injuries, they could be easily on par with the Eagles. That's how highly I think of this group. Now, how to utilize an offensive concepts baffles me because when you have Zeke playing the only offensive line role on your last play of the season, that is not a good indication of using this talented line. So as long as they don't have Zeke playing center, this team is going to be rock solid blocking the entire time. And the only thing that's going to hold this team back from reaching the ceiling in Detroit, in my mind, is the health of Tyron Smith. If Tyron Smith can stay healthy, this team is going to have one of the best units in the NFC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dallas, yeah, I think they're going to be good. Yeah, their offensive line obviously has a lot of great starters on there. I didn't have them in my top 5, but I personally think they probably, are just right outside of this top 5 group. But my number 3 guys is, I think, someone you already talked about, the Cleveland Browns. And I guess, I mean, everything you said already was pretty valid for these Cleveland Browns. I mean, like, all the guys you have here are solid players. They've already proven themselves to be, at worst, starting players in the league. And like, I think even if you look at last season, they technically underperformed based off expectations, but the fact that they were still a good unit and still considered an underperforming unit, I think speaks volumes as to like how good of an offensive line this can be. Like their center, he broke out last season. I am just reading right here that he allowed 10 pressures all season, and like I didn't really know about him before, and I think he was probably the weakest link maybe followed by Jack Conklin on this offensive line. But the fact that, the guy that I thought might be the worst only allowed 10 pressures. Plus, you got guys like Joel Bitonio, who is one of the best offensive linemen in the league. He was a PFF All Pro at the left guard, and you can't really ask for better players at these positions. And I think, yeah, as a unit, this is a really sound group. And like you said, Nick Chubb, plays really good behind these guys. I think they both elevate each other's play, and I think we'll see with the full commitment to Deshaun Watson this year that this O line will really look good, especially just building that chemistry with the quarterback this season.
Yeah, not much to add. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know much about Porches, so I didn't mention him. But
Mm-hmm.
just hearing that stat and imagining how hard that is to do, game in and game out when you first thrust in that starting role is ridiculous. I
Mm-hmm.
think, um, honestly, that team is a dark horse because of
Mm-hmm.
how well they built themselves in the trenches to make a deep run in the playoffs. So it'll be exciting to see how well their O line and D line fare this season. Number two, I'm gonna rehash a team you already talked about. I'm way more bullish, I guess, on the prospects of this team because they've never ranked as a top 10 offensive line ever. And it's probably the reason why they went a huge stretch without having a 1,000 yard rusher. But I think the addition of Halapuli Vaitai, I think that's how you say his name. I think I probably butchered it badly, but adding him to the Lions is going to be absolute heaven in my projections because the way the rest of the team filled out, you already mentioned what Panay Sewell and Taylor Decker could do. They're probably the best tackle duo in the league, um, better than what Cleveland has. Um, and then you have solid guards in Jonah Jackson and Vaitai now. And then Grant Bagnall has been better, like as good as any center in the NFL. He's only allowed one sack all last season. So when I look at that, I'm not too worried on the fact that I have Jared Goff versus
Mm-hmm.
maybe a better talented quarterback because Jared Goff functions best when he has no pressure around him and he can grow in rhythm and go for his reads properly. And I think this line will help him do that. And if you're thinking about guys like Jameer Gibbs, who has to pass protect, maybe he's not going to be asked to do as much because of how talented this group is. And David Montgomery is going to freeze. I think this is going to be a large reason why everybody's like so high on Detroit, but only looking at the weapons. I would look at this O line and say they did a great job building the trenches here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like last season they made Jared Goff look like an elite quarterback, like a borderline elite quarterback, and I feel like a lot of teams saw that after he got traded from the Rams to the Lions that he was going to be just, a basic bridge quarterback that was probably going to get phased out likely this season actually, but based off last season's play, he obviously showed everybody that he was almost like Geno Smith. He didn't write back, but um, but yeah, he played really good last season, and I think it goes back to this offensive line, like you said. He plays best in that clean pocket when there's not as much pressure. I mean, every quarterback plays better, but I think he really steps it up when he's given that kind of opportunity. But for my number two offensive line group, I had the Kansas City Chiefs here. um, this again, I think is an elite unit. I think it's kind of crazy. The last couple of years, I feel like their tackle positions have been a revolving door, but each year their tackles almost just seem to play better than they did in the last season. And I was looking at last, you had what, like Orlando Brown at your left tackle spot, and I'm like, how much better can you get than Orlando Brown? And it's like, well, their offensive line really didn't take a step back. Like their left tackle, which I thought their current weakest player on their team, I think, or in the offensive line, I think, is Donovan Smith, and I think he let up like only 6 sacks last season. And if that's like your weak link on your team, I feel like it's a pretty nice unit to have. Followed up by you got Joe Thuney, who's been solid his entire career. Creed Humphrey, a guy who probably in a redraft he'd probably go first round in his draft class. Trey Smith, he exploded last season. He played really well out of kind of nowhere. I didn't think he was gonna be that good, but he did. And then they got Jawan Taylor this offseason. He was my number one right tackle or just tackle in general. going into this free agency. I really wanted the Broncos to get him, but I mean, he got the highest contract in free agency for offensive linemen, I think, out of literally everybody. So I mean, it makes sense why they're paying him that much, but just kind of all these things. Plus, you see how electric the Chiefs' offense is, especially the more time you give Mahomes, the more dangerous that team becomes. And so that's why I have them listed at my number 2 spot for my offensive line groups.
Yeah. I love 4 of the 5 guys they have in their lineup. I think you touched upon it, but um, yeah, Donovan Smith had his worst season last year, and he allowed 6 sacks. But I also noticed times where he kind of let the Buccaneers down a little bit, especially when you're talking about like
Mm-hmm.
blocking for Tom Brady and how it's so important to make sure you secure the interior and outer parts of your offensive line.
Mm-hmm.
I just saw plays where he just got flat out beat. And when I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at Kansas City and you're going against Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and um, and Denver now, like you're gonna have speed rushers and like finesse rushers both, and Donovan Smith better like shape up to be that blindside blocker
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise teams are just gonna overload that left side of the line and force Mahomes to get rid of the ball fast or like get off
Mm-hmm.
his first read because they can afford to
Yeah.
do it by just constantly attacking Donovan Smith.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have him in the top 5 just because of that. I think
Mm-hmm.
I need to see like proof that it can address that compared to what I've seen in the other areas of the line. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a solid selection regardless. I think they're firmly in the
Mm-hmm.
top 10 for sure. I just don't have them top 5. But if
Mm-hmm.
Donovan Smith has a better season and returns to his baseline, then then I could see them being top 5
Mm-hmm.
because I loved Creed Humphrey coming out of the draft. I love the fact that Trey Smith made some strides ever since his rookie season. And I love the 3 interior guys they've had. I think that's going to be great for Mahomes. So it's kind of like a wait and see approach. I don't know what this looks like. It's kind of like how I felt when they had Juju and McCole Hardman starting on that team. I was just kind of like, I don't know. I wish they had better. I wish they had better.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm just looking at one spot on this offensive line and then having those complaints, you're in a good spot compared to where
Mm-hmm.
you were in the Super Bowl against the Buccaneers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. I think just like the tight ends, I don't think we have any debate on number 1 at all. It was the opposing side to Kansas City this past Super Bowl. This is the Philadelphia Eagles. I think it's the number 1 reason why they did so well last season. Um, you look at Mailata, you look at Dickinson, you look at Kelsey, you look at Jurgens now, you look at Lane Johnson. Yeah, they're having a change. They're having a new right guard, but they thought ahead in advance to get Jurgens just for this reason. And he was actually supposed to replace Jason Kelsey, but now he's just playing right next to him. So um,
Mm-hmm.
when I look at this team, like the only limit on this team is penalties. While they had the most penalized in the NFL,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that they were so efficient, despite that, just shows how good this line is. They can overcome
Mm-hmm.
any amount of penalties. Um, Lane Johnson might be the best right tackle in the league. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he only allowed 1 sack since like the 2020 season, I think, which is just mind-boggling to me. Um, and I don't see any setbacks here.
Yeah. This is yeah, great unit. Obviously, I had them ranked number 1 as well for my offensive line units. Here, I'll pick that up. But yeah, I mean, I look at this offensive line and really don't see too many weaknesses. I think the Eagles do a phenomenal job at getting offensive linemen earlier than they need to, just so that they can have guys developing, so that once someone leaves, they got the guy immediately there to ready themselves up. Like I mean, like Jason Peters, he honestly he played like forever. He's like a bajillion years old, and he retired when he was like a bajillion years old. But they drafted the guys that they needed to get these guys for replacing these guys, just because you don't know when these guys decide to retire. Kelsey, he could literally say that he wants to retire tomorrow, and he's not, but he's old enough to do that. Lane Johnson's had a plenty long career, and he could retire whenever. But the Eagles just do a great job at having elite depth behind they're already elite starters, and I think that's what keeps them at this number one spot. Even, when they weren't maybe considered as elite of a team, I think that it was still pretty easy to rank Eagles at least as a top five offensive line unit for the past maybe like 5+ years, honestly, maybe even past 10 years, ever since they had Peters, Kelsey, and Johnson as their core trio.
Yeah. You said all you needed to say, and I think honestly, that it's going to lead to them being the best rushing unit in the league this season again, and it's you can line up like Dallas has such a great D line, but if I just look at them against the Eagles O line, I'm just like it's a mismatch. That's how good this unit is together because they have the chemistry. These guys had time to develop since they've drafted. It's just like an offensive line factory. That's what they focus on, and I think that's so huge when we're looking at our criteria again. Yes, you want to be good at pass blocking. Yes, you want to be good at run blocking, but you have to know each other. You have to compensate. You need that time to get to know each other. Like, there's a reason why rookies don't do so well in the league compared to how they do like in their second and third year. They just understand the systems. They understand who they're working with, and they get that time to build cohesion. I think Philadelphia is the gold standard for developing continuity in the O line.
Hmm. Yeah, it's I don't know. It's kind of crazy though. Like we had our top rankings for our tight ends and offensive line so far have just been uh the same. It's kind of it's impressive how which is like pretty standardized. I mean, even with quarterback, we're pretty standard on that too. With Patrick Mahomes, I think is our top guy, and just continues here. And it kind of, I mean, it's almost like a trend almost of like certain teams just know how to get things done, and we kind of see this with our rankings here in terms of how well they do throughout the season. And like we look, the Chiefs, they got the number one quarterback, a number one tight end. To me, the one of the top offensive lines, and they won the Super Bowl. You have the Eagles here, who I think we put Jalen Hurts as a top five quarterback. We have their tight end is the number five tight end, and then we have them having the number one offensive line. And they were the other Super Bowl contender. But next up, we do have the defensive line units, and within this, we're also including like just pass rusher like involved with defensive line units as well. So we're not stubbing out, outside linebacker, pass rush, edge guys that technically aren't defensive linemen, but basically are. But what is your main criteria, I guess, for determining what is the best defensive line?
Yeah, I think it's definitely multidimensional, like pass rushes and rushes. Like obviously, stopping the run is extremely important. Otherwise, you're never going to get in a situation where you can get a sack. But it's also when you're rushing the passer, do you have the same move every time, or are you a one-trick pony, or are there ways you can get to the quarterback without relying on your athleticism? Can you win with technique? I always stress that, but I think that's so huge in the defensive line because you're playing so many snaps, and one snap is the game changer between allowing a 60-yard touchdown and getting a sack to force a punt. And while I talk about sacks a lot, I also look at the hurries. Like, do you force the quarterback to speed up his process to make a dumb decision when if he had the time in the pocket, he wouldn't have thrown that ball? Can you force the quarterback to make mistakes? Can you have awareness and knock the ball down instead of marking it incomplete because you have a game-changing play? Can you diagnose like shifts and motions well and things like that? I look at all of those things when I'm looking at these players.
Hmm. Yeah, I kind of looked similar things, and then I also looked, in terms of hurries and sacks, and even I guess run stops. It's kind of harder to track that metric, but overall, I feel like you can kind of catch the vibes of teams that are kind of better against the run, and that's something that went slightly into my rankings. But also, just I guess I think depth was a big part in my eyes. Maybe not it's not like the final criteria piece, but I think that was something that mattered to me, especially just I think we saw with like the Bills last season after Von Miller went down, their defensive or their defensive line unit went from maybe like just above middle of the pack to maybe a bottom 10 defensive line unit in the league, and so just having that depth is a key piece. And then just overall cohesiveness, guys that just play good with each other, because you could have one elite guy that carries your team, but or that should carry your team on defense, but if just there isn't that connection, I guess, between your unit, that ends up and like it just kind of minimizes your potential. And so that's something that I also kind of thought about. But yeah, more or less what you thought, and then just a few other kind of like mind games that I played with myself. But who is your top five, or not top five, but your number five guy in terms of
Yeah.
defensive
So
units?
number five happens. Don't worry. It's one of the units I was talking about when I was shocked that the Saints allowed 3 sacks to one of these 3 teams, and they actually upgraded their opposite pass rusher to their primary one, which I think is going to be huge for them. Um, they already had one of the best edge rushers in the entire league, and they made quality additions to their defensive line in multiple spots. It's the Cleveland Browns. When I look at their line in total, outside of Myles Garrett, replacing Clowney with Zadarius Smith was huge for them. I think that's overlooked. I also think the addition of Okoronkwo, I think his first name is Algonia, could totally butcher that again. But he's always graded out in his 5 seasons as a top 30 edge rusher in the league. Sorry, in his past 2 seasons, former 5th round pick, like graded top 30 both the seasons. Underrated signing, and that's their that should like change up to Myles Garrett and Zadarius Smith. But to have him as a top 30 rusher is huge. Then you add Dalvin Tomlinson from the Giants on your team, and that's huge to addressing their weakness from last season. So when you add him to Jordan Elliott, who I'm high on, and then like you have good depth with Shelby Harris, Tristan Hill, Tommy Togai, um, not much, but compliments all around because it's going to help the rest of their front seven, which has uber athletic linebackers.
Mm-hmm.
Adjusting the front four where you could just win with four, I think was a huge need for them, and they done a good job adjusting it.
Yeah, I think they're a pretty good unit. I don't know. I don't think I had them in my top five, believe it or not. I think they were. I think they might be like number six. Honestly, with my like 4-5 ranking, I was like stuck between maybe 3 or 4 teams. That's because I feel like when I look back at some of the just record predictions that we made earlier, um, I felt like we talked a lot about how these defensive units are the ones to carry, or kind of carry that burden for a team that may be closer to that 500 range. And so I think that there's a lot of good defensive units in the league that made it hard for me. But for my number five group, I had the Miami Dolphins. Initially, I guess before I was looking into kind of these defensive units or defensive line units, I probably wouldn't have had Miami as a top five group, but I kind of looked into, I guess, just what the team had in general, and I really liked what I saw. I think one just piece that I really liked about this group was, I guess, just the age range that they had. For the most part, these guys are, I'm pretty sure all their starting defensive line pass rush guys are under 30 years old, and this means you have time for these guys to develop, like genuinely develop, and a lot of these guys have a great opportunity to take that next step in their game this upcoming season, whereas maybe like a pass rusher in their 30s, or even a defensive, like a run stopping defensive lineman in their 30s, they can be good, but it's harder to see them have those breakout seasons. And so that's one thing I liked. But you already kind of saw a few other guys break out last season, like Jalen Phillips. He was really good last season. He kind of came out of nowhere for me. I kind of forgot about him, but I look back and I'm like, oh wait, he was kind of good. They acquired Bradley Chubb for a first round pick. I think that last season he kind of was okay with the Dolphins, mostly just, again, I think he didn't have the time to really gel with the team. And so I think with a full offseason, Bradley Chubb kind of gets better, especially with teams keying on Phillips. Plus, I really like their main three guys, or their bottom down three guys, down the down linemen. of Christian Wilkins, Raekwon Davis, and Emmanuel Ogba. I think the three of these guys are elite run stoppers, and you know, I think that I'm pretty sure that the Dolphins had one of the best run stop defenses in the league last season, and you really can't do that without a guy like Raekwon Davis in the middle, who's like a behemoth of a man, and like he basically allowed this team to stay competitive in terms of just stopping the run. Let's see if I think I saw a crazy stat about it. I don't know if it was, but uh, okay, I don't have the run statistic up, but I'm pretty sure they were one of the best run stopping units in the league. But that's why I had them at my number 5 spot.
I mean, when you talk about Raekwon Davis, he's like 6'7", 340 pounds. Once he's in the backfield, you are not evading him. I'm sorry. There's absolutely no way you could do that. I I love that your number 5 selection actually. I probably wouldn't have put them at 5, but looking at their depth chart, I've always loved Christian Wilkins' game. I loved Jalen Phillips when he was coming out of the draft. I thought he was an underrated defensive end they selected for sure. And when the age thing is definitely one thing to be optimistic about if you're a Dolphins fan, because even if they don't put it together this season for whatever reason, they have the time to work together to do that, and it's in the budget. So when I'm looking at this roster, the upside, well worth being a top 5 selection in my mind, because they already it's not like it's a potential based pick either. They showed they're one of the best running stop teams in the league, and if you think about where this team ended up last season, they lost by 3 to the Buffalo Bills without Tua Tagovailoa, with a third string quarterback. And I feel like all the dishes they made in the offseason to add to the D line is going to be huge to like offset that. So great selection. I went with the long-standing defenses in the AFC North again for number 4, and I think just because they're getting older doesn't mean they're any less good. It's the Pittsburgh Steelers. I just look at TJ Watt and that's it. End of argument. Seriously, I look at they added Ogunjobi. They still have Cameron Hayward. They added Keanu Benson in the draft. I just love what these guys did in the draft. They kept Highsmith, who's an up and coming rusher. I love the starting like D line that they have. And I look at Armand Watts. He wasn't bad on the Bears, and they had the depth there. That they have the depth there to do it. And I'm looking at the rest of this like roster. When you think about adding Joey Porter, what will he need? He'll need a good defensive line, and I think Benson's going to be the new Hayward. That's how I think he's going to be. Ogunjobi proved he can win one-on-one rushes by himself, and you know TJ Watt's going to always like command a double or a triple team sometimes with the way he can just change games like instantly. He could be better than his brother, which is like unfathomable to say like 5 years from now. But wow, like I have to put this team in 4.
Yeah, I think the Steelers are another good team. I have them higher up in my rankings, so see a little bit more what I have to say about them later. But for my number 4 group, I had the Washington Commanders. Now with these guys, I think they are almost everything the Dolphins have, but just better. And so it was pretty easy for me to say that if I was going to put the Dolphins in, I had to put the Commanders at least one ahead of them, and so that's what I did here. Their starting 4 on that defensive line is pretty elite. I think that's a unit that you honestly could just leave them do their thing and then keep all the rest of your guys in coverage and have a pretty low blitz percentage type team. I think I read that all 4 of their starters are former first round picks, and they're not even that old in the first place. I mean, Chase Young, I think you hope that he plays better. I mean, he was like what defensive rookie of the year, but I think that he's still kind of been underwhelming so far in his career, despite I mean, mainly with the sack numbers. He's still an elite run defender. followed up with Montez Sweat having a career year last season, and I still can't get over his 40 time when he got drafted. It's like a 4.41 or something like that, I think.
That's
Um,
ridiculous.
and it's crazy. The man is like, I don't know, what is he, like 250 or something, and he's running a 4.440. I'm like homeboy could be playing wide receiver with that kind of speed and like just absolutely body people. But yeah, I think the reason, like, so I think, yeah, this team has the potential to be phenomenal. Even I got to even talk about Jonathan Allen yet, right? But I just think that again, it's a team that's more so built on potential, that I think that they haven't quite lived up to what their peak could be, and that's why I have them at 4. Maybe not the number 1 spot here, but I think that this upcoming season, if Chase Young, I guess, has an up year again, and then everybody else just kind of plays good or just as is or gets better, I think that this is easily another team to consider as one of the best defenses in the league.
Yeah, great selection. I had them higher up. I actually had them at 3. Um, because similar to what you mentioned with the Dolphins and kind of looking for that primary edge rusher, yes, I know Pittsburgh has like a more credible threat, like with a proven top 3, if not best edge rusher in the league in TJ Watt. But I think Chase Young is a guy who's capable. Like, and as far as, and this is not like just projection or potential. This is like a reasonable expectation. He can be that. You mentioned Jonathan Allen. He was a top 20 interior defender for 3 straight seasons, which is wild to have that consistency. Montez Sweat, one of his best seasons. You mentioned that. Deron Payne is like probably the weakest link on this team, and he, like you mentioned, former first round pick, still a great player. It's pick your poison with these guys. Like, you can't double any because the other will beat you. Like, you have to single up on these guys and hope for the best. And it was a large factor on why this team went 8-1, I think, last year. Um, they great team. They're going to be led by their defense, and their defensive line is the identity of the Commanders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like we gave them an awful record for our predictions, which again I keep on saying sucks, but I do think that this team easily could overcome that just with how elite this defense could be, especially just because they're 4 down linemen, or their front 4 or whatever is just such a lethal unit to have as a team. And like I could you could even argue some of the teams I have ranked higher than the Commanders wish they had the Commanders, uh, you know, 4 guys. But I think just with other things that you have to think about, at least as of now, some of these other teams I have ahead are just maybe slightly better. And so I know you had these guys at number 4, but I put the Pittsburgh Steelers at number 3. And like you said, I feel like just TJ Watt speaks for himself. I think that like even without the rest of the guys on this defense line, you could have like just literally quite the most average NFL players at these other spots on this defensive line. And you're already saying that this defensive line group is a top 10 unit. And you add that along with the additions plus the veterans that they have on this team. I mean, like Cameron Hayward, he is older, but like he plays phenomenal football. And I'm not gonna predict when he's gonna get bad until he does get bad. And then they added Keanu Benton in the draft too. You know, I mean, you could debate on how if he was the best, guy in that spot to pick, but again, he's a good. He got drafted high for a reason. Plus Larry Ogunjobi, so it's not like Keanu Benton's thrown out to the wolves, in terms of having to lead a defensive line group by himself. He's literally surrounded by the best guys you could have. And then Alex Highsmith, he had a breakout year last season. I didn't know how well he was going to play, but he was surprisingly good. And then I think they have decent depth. I don't know if it's the best group of guys to have for depth, but depth is depth for a reason. And so I think that um, it's a solid unit to have. I think TJ Watt alone just outclasses quite literally, I think, everybody on the Commanders. Plus, you have other elite players on that team, which leads me to have them at this number 3 spot.
Yeah, and I think I might go the other way in this too when you mentioned McCown and Benson. I think the Steelers really need him to play right away and
Mm-hmm.
effectively immediately. And compare that with Washington, who already has experienced players who are used to playing together. They just got to stay in the field. I would rather have the Commanders situation and the depth and like starting depth that way than I would the
Hmm.
Steelers.
Hmm.
But I think there's no debate on who both of our top twos are and which order they are, honestly. And we both have the 49ers at two.
Hmm.
Um, I look at this team outside of Nick Bosa, and it's very well constructed.
Hmm.
And on top of that, they still have a weak Armstead. Um, Jackson's probably the weak link. They want him to take another step. Um, but I look at their depth in addition to adding Javon Hargrave to add more pass rushing. Their depth is Javon Kinlaw, Cleveland Farrell, Kerry Hyder, um, and then some. And Taco Charlton. And these are all guys who are like former first round picks or um, like well talked about. Like Kerry Hyder was a really good player for Minnesota, and like he's the backup to Jackson, their second year player. Javon Kinlaw, first round pick with hype. Cleveland Farrell, first round pick, overpriced but hyped. Taco Charlton, first round pick, hyped. Like they have the talent there, and they have the coaching and like the defensive line factory going on in San Francisco. And
Hmm.
I look at that and I'm just like, how could you not bet against this team as being one of the top three defensive lines again?
Hmm. Yeah, and it's like this defensive line unit is so good that they can literally afford players to have down years. They can afford to have busts in their draft, and they can afford to let go of players. And like, because I feel like we saw a couple years ago, Solomon Thomas drafted in the first round was a bust. But despite that, I mean, they were still an elite unit, and then they let go of DeForest Buckner a couple seasons ago, and people were saying that Eric Armstead isn't good enough to replace him. They're not going to have the same production as they did in the past. And well, I mean, Buckner's arguably one of the best interior line defensive linemen in the league still, but despite that, Eric Armstead feels like he's kind of aged like fine wine in terms of every year that he's been with this group, he just seems to play better. And I think that it's just a really good unit to have that is really gelled well together. And that's why they're able to play at such an elite level. And that's why they're able to afford guys to either develop, let guys go, afford, players to bust, just because the talent here is so elite that um, they can overcome it pretty easily.
Nothing more to add.
Hmm. Next up, we have our number ones. Who would it be?
Arizona Cardinals.
Could be. I mean, like, I don't even know who they have on that defensive line.
Yeah, after Zach Allen left, I don't know who's on that team anymore.
I don't know.
Very interesting though. This team, like, they don't have the edge rushers we talked about in like the other teams, which is like the one like you really gotta watch out for because they have like three or four of them. And then from what we discussed in the draft about this team and how well they built their defensive line, how else could you pick like except a different team that just have like the league leading sacks in the league last year, and they've added more talent to increase the number of hurries on top of it. It's the Philadelphia Eagles.
Hmm.
Look at Brandon Graham, Josh Sweat, like they're if they were on separate teams, they would be the number one pass rushers that on their own. Then you have Jalen Carter's declared the starter, and they had a different defensive tackle. It was his teammate Jordan Davis. They're going to play. They're going to play right next to each other and right next to Fletcher Cox. Three big bodies, and you don't want to double any of them, but you might have to double one of them. Like, how is that
Hmm.
going to work? They're all equally as talented at this stage of their careers, and
Hmm.
it's just mind-boggling to me. Then you look at their depth with Minton Williams. Then you have Derek Barnett, who was a quality edge rusher for that team. And you're just like, they got everything. They absolutely have everything. Like, how he's building another machine, equally as far as like San Francisco, but more production out of them. That's why I have them over.
Hmm. Yeah, and like Josh, I also had the Eagles as my number one defensive line unit. I believe that this unit was had like the least. ran the least amount of blitzes, or one of the least amount of blitzes in the league last season, but still had, you know, elite pressure rates, had elite hurry rates, had a ton of sacks last season. And I mean, as I look at this and I look at their team, and like you got guys like Hassan Reddick and Nolan Smith who are technically listed as off-ball linebackers, but they're also like elite at, generating pressure. But they're so good that they don't even need these guys to generate pressure and can, just fully focus on their off-ball game, which is pretty crazy. And like you said, I really like the depth on this team. Um, like a guy could go down and you really have anybody to choose from on this defense to fill in that spot pretty easily. And I mean, there's not really much more to say about this unit. They're just an elite group of players. And I think a huge part of this as well is, I mean, they draft guys, they draft a lot of guys from Georgia, right? And while it's kind of like, it's funny and stuff, but I think that it also benefits these guys quite a lot just because these guys already have experience playing with each other, and so you're minimizing that time it takes to maybe gel as a unit. As if you got like the best guy, like one guy from Bama, one guy from Ohio State, a guy from Georgia, and maybe, I don't know, a guy from Oregon or something, right? And like you don't even have to get them to like play off of each other because they already know how to do that, just because they've spent so much time doing that already. And now they're doing that at a pro level behind potential future Hall of Famers like Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, to, just show them how it's done, basically.
They basically have Fletcher Cox, Kenny Clark, and Aaron Donald lining up right next to each other, causing havoc on the interior. That's how good like Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis could be.
Mm-hmm.
And they already know how each other play. They can play off each other. They can throw changeups. They can run all different types of stunts. Like all of that matters when you have continuity, and even on the college level and things like that. So handling the run stopping like abilities, they have that. They know how they play off each other. So even if they're not individually good at stopping the run or like a certain pass rush move, they don't need to be because they're right next to each other. They know how each other plays off. If I take this B gap, you're gonna take the A gap and help me out. They already have those discussions. They already know like those tendencies. When you call like different plays, the defensive line hardly changes. That's what makes it one of the hardest positions as well, because you're gonna have to focus on how you change up your pass rush or for your rush angles. And with the Eagles, you don't have to worry about that because Brandon Graham's been there for a long time. Fletcher Cox has been there for a long time. Josh Sweat has been there for a while now. And then Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis just came out of the same program in Georgia. They know how that operates and they know each other. So it just goes back to the longer you spend with each other and the more talented you are, obviously, those two are going to make it one of the best pass rushing units in the league.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you covered it. Like it's an elite group. It's kind of crazy how we had the Eagles' offensive line and their defensive line unit as the number one groups of guys, and it's pretty incredible how they've just been able to build depth on both sides of the trenches here, and just create unbelievably elite units on both sides of the ball. And I think that's what helps lead them to being one of the best teams in the league and being a Super Bowl contender and likely running away with the NFC title again this season. But um, anything else you want to add in terms of, I mean, things that you saw, or maybe got, or units maybe that you thought maybe just missed the list? Could be tight ends that you wanted to address but just couldn't fit into the top five.
Yeah, I mean, going back to tight ends, I think two guys that could easily make the top five. Like, I always hold out hope for Foster Moreau.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna be that crazy and put him in this list. But
Mm-hmm.
like two reasonable guys that could easily crack top five, in my opinion. One is Kyle Pitts. If that quarterback
Mm-hmm.
situation changes and suddenly Atlanta's looking like at a different QB,
Mm-hmm.
let's say Deshaun Watson doesn't pan out, and then for some reason Atlanta wants to take a crack at him. That would easily be the best quarterback that Kyle Pitts has ever had.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one guy, and then um, I'm trying to think. I'm blanking out on the tight ends. I'll have to look at some of the rankings to try and get an idea. I don't know why I can't think of it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Any tight ends that you think of?
Yeah. So I guess just two guys off the top of my head that I was thinking about was one being Pat Fryermuth. He's the Steelers' starting tight end right now. He, I guess, isn't the biggest name in the league right now. I mean, last season, I think, yeah, he had 732 receiving yards, which is it's pretty nice for such a young tight end. I feel like a lot of tight ends take quite some time to break out and have these types of seasons, and so I think that he's one that maybe borderlines this list. Maybe next season I could see him getting onto this top five list. And then, I mean, Darren Waller, I think if he,
That was the
stays
one. It
healthy
was Darren Waller.
and puts up similar numbers as he did at the beginning with his tenure with the Raiders, I think that he's another guy that could fall in. But yeah, I also agree there with Kyle Pitts. It'll be interesting to see how he plays this upcoming season. I know a lot of people were hyped for him last season, especially after his rookie year, but kind of had a middling season. You can put that to quarterback play and whatnot, but it's kind of all I have for now. You want to add anything to Darren Waller? Or?
I want to ask something on Fryermuth because I think he's always been overshadowed just ever since he was the second tight end taken to um, Kyle Pitts. And I think it's a perfect example of like how like players have to go into the right situation. Like the Pittsburgh's basically treating him as like Heath Miller Jr. In that offense, and I think um, he's the safety blanket for Kenny Pickett. He's utilized a lot more than that, and he should be. And I think he and Najee Harris are the focal points of the offense right now, even with Pickens and Deontay Johnson there, and the amount of like receivers they just have in that roster. So,
Mhm.
um, a lot of good tight ends we mentioned in fantasy. But there's one tight end probably getting underrated, and I'm not even drafting him to be honest. Because I'm looking farther down the board, but I would love some Pat Fryermuth on my team if I can get it.
Mhm.
So don't sleep on him. There's a chance he could be a top five. We don't have him there right now, but I'm not ruling it out.
Mhm. Yeah, but all come down to what we see next season. But anyways, that's kind of all we have for today. Oops. But yeah, remember to follow us on our Instagram, amon.a.mission. Um, I mean, we're trying to hopefully soon start uploading more interesting content besides new episodes up. Please watch it. But um, we're trying to keep things updated, trying to keep things cool. Let us know if you wanted us to talk about anything else. Tell us about our rankings, what you thought of them. But that's all I got for today. Peace out.
Peace.